Welcome to the Samuele Tini Show, where business, innovation and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in. Welcome to a new episode. And today we are going to discuss something that is really important. We are going to discuss growth, our obsession about growth, which are other ways to discuss this. And is it possible to have grow with sustainability, or which are the other ways? And we're doing this with an expert, Professor Tim Jackson from the University of Surrey, who has wrote extensively about the topic. Thank you so much, Tim, for being here with us today.
No, it's a pleasure, Samuele. Thank you for inviting me.
And Tim, you have really created a bridge, academia, real world policy, advocacy. So can you tell a bit more about you? What is your journey?
Well, it's a strange and wonderful journey from being, I guess I would say a mathematician and a philosopher to a part-time playwright, and then ultimately an accidental economist. And so it's in the course of my professional life, most of which has been spent in relatively academic economics, that my quest to understand our obsession with economic growth began, and I began to see it underlying everything. I was working basically in sustainability and in the sort of microeconomics of sustainability, and then I began to see everywhere the influence of our desire for economic growth, the political pursuit of economic growth, the business pursuit of economic growth, and to see how that skewed all our decision making. And then one day I was in a meeting actually where a graph was presented, a figure was presented of an index, which was a sort of index of sustainable economic welfare. It was developed by the late ecological economist Herman Daly and a few of his colleagues. And it showed the line of increasing GDP, the line of growth going forever upwards and upwards and upwards. And against it, it showed another line, which was a sort of revised index. If you take into account the costs of growth, if you take into account the inequality of the outcomes of growth, and you created a line that showed that progress, what would that look like? And what really struck me was that although the line followed the line of growth upwards for a little while, in about the 1970s, 1980s, it began to depart from that upward line and was stationary, began to be stable, even came down at certain points in time. And I found that fascinating. And so my introduction to it was to try and reproduce the same results in a couple of other countries, and found the same thing, basically, that if you think about sustainable economic welfare rather than just the output of economic growth, it doesn't have the same pattern. It doesn't go up and up forever. And that led me to question the entire concept of economic growth.
And this is, so a very solid foundation, and it's really what we see, no? What we are taught in MBAs, externality, don't look for that, and just focus on economic growth. But the social and economic dimension more and more are calling us and holding us accountable. And I want to ask you this, is critical. We see it in the policy making, we see it in the newspaper, we read the Financial Times, everywhere is GDP. Growth obsession. Everybody, it seems that our lives are condensed around one number. If a politician is not working because GDP is going down, or other. So how this obsession has come to the world, and how we can solve this?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And it actually has a long history. You can look at it philosophically, you can look at it historically, you can look at it in economic terms. I think in like the shorter term, and I'm talking about nearly 100 years now, it's our obsession with it sort of came out of the Great Depression. At that point in time, our model of the economy to produce more and more, to have more and more people buy it, came off the rails a little bit. And we found ourselves in difficult circumstances. Lots of people lost their jobs. There was actually a lot of people also were in dire physical circumstances because they lost their jobs. Some of them lost their lives. And this was a period between the two world wars, sort of, the late 1920s and the 1930s, beginning of the 1930s, when the economic model sort of went off the rails. And the assumption was it went off the rails because economic growth stopped. and there wasn't enough demand for all these new goods that we had suddenly had the ability to produce with our wonderful new technology, and that this should never happen again. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, I think there was a period in time in which we put in place the institutions of what are now called the New World Order, and they were institutions built around the idea that the economy should grow and grow, and the measure of that growth should be the gross domestic product, which had been developed during the war, in fact, as a way of trying to account for how much the Allies could afford to spend on the war effort. And it was a clever system. It was the account system is something I have a lot of time for, but it led to the primacy of this idea of the GDP as being the one single political measure that matters. And if you can make that go up, you're success. If it goes down, then you're a disaster. And we lived inside that developing obsession for the last 70 or 80 years. So that's the kind of a, you know, short story of how we came to be so obsessed with it. There's another story which I just want to talk about a little bit, which is that it has a kind of religious aspect to it at the moment. If you listen to people talking about growth, they talk about it like they're at church and they're rehearsing a well-known creed. I believe this, I believe that, I believe in growth. This department, this government is a growth-based department. Growth is our number one mission. GDP is everything, and there's something religious about that. And I don't think that's accidental. I think the economics of the GDP began to sort of displace the idea of God as an organizing principle. And because we happened during those early years of the 20th century to be suffering from a world without God, we lived in a world which had a God-shaped hole in it. Economics and the GDP was a way of filling that hole. It offers us a vision of hope, to this idea that the GDP will make life better and better, that more and more is better and better, and life will be richer for our kids ad infinitum as long as we can grow the economy, had a sort of religious aspect to it as well. So it's a combination, if you like, of economic design and something deeper that is almost religious in its connotations.
Thank you, Tim, for that. I mean, and I know about the cost of the war for Britain and the origin, but this part it actually struck me because it is true. It's become. I mean, you cannot question it. It's like something that, and of course, during the war, the Holocaust, and all this. So maybe the two-world war. So maybe economics has taken the place of a God that was feeding. But of course, we know that there are limits to grow. We know that there are the downsides of this continuous growth, that destruction of the planet, the boundaries, and all this, that also economics teach us. So your proposition, you started in 2009 with prosperity without growth, and then slowly it's become a reference point. So can you share with us the key points of your proposition? How we can, it sounds like an oxymoron, how we can be prosperous without growth?
Well, the starting point is to ask about, what's the meaning of prosperity? What can prosperity possibly mean, and what can it mean on a finite planet? And so, as you see, as you say, the conventional wisdom and economics certainly is that prosperity is about income. Income is income, wealth, productivity, all of the things, the language of economics, the language of business, and that's what prosperity is. But it's interesting because that's quite a new, modern-ish framing of what prosperity is. And if you go back to the origins of the word prosperity, prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and expectations, it has a much broader feel to it, that we can use that actually as the starting point for an inquiry into what it can mean to live well on a finite planet. And that's one of the things that Prosperity Without Growth was doing. I should say, it started its life actually as a report to the UK government. And I was working for a commission at that time, a Sustainable Development Commission. I was reporting directly to the Prime Minister of the UK. That was the structure of that commission. And I can remember very distinctly when we announced that we were going to have this inquiry. It was just an inquiry. It wasn't even, we hadn't come up with a title. We hadn't decided on where we were going to go. We're just going to have an inquiry about the idea of economic growth on a finite planet. And I remember an economist from one of the government departments standing up the back of this meeting where we were talking about the work that we were just about to begin, saying, now I know what sustainability means. It means going back to live in caves, doesn't it? They're sort of attacking us for even asking the question. So as you say, it's such a taboo subject, or was such a taboo subject to ask questions about. And I was stunned, really, because I kind of thought naively, well, I'm just asking, it's a finite planet. The economy gets bigger and bigger. The impacts on the planet are non-negligible. Shouldn't we have it on the table? Shouldn't we say something? Shouldn't we sit down and have a look at it and say, how can we actually possibly get out of this conundrum of finite planet, infinite growth? And the response was visceral. The response was, how dare you question the bastion of economics? You must be savages. And it was a lesson in the limitations of realpolitik, for sure. But that was the starting point, was to say, actually, the meaning of prosperity as a word isn't wealth. So maybe we can think about it as something different. And the something different that I came up with at that time, and I've pursued really as an idea since then, that first and foremost, our prosperity surely is about health. And as soon as you come up with that idea and you look through the history of people writing the wisdom of the sages, the poets, the philosophers, you find that idea again and again. The only true wealth is health, there is no wealth but health, as some have put it. Or Rumi, the poet, once put it, I went searching for my wealth and I found only my health. This idea that actually, if we're not well, if we're not healthy, all of the rest of it doesn't matter, is really powerful, and it does kind of, it sort of resonates with people. If you go out on the street and ask them what matters in their lives, what it is that makes them feel as though they're living well, health comes up again and again in some form or another as being a priority. Now, what that does, and it started with prosperity without growth, and it went on through my writing since then. It opens out the idea: what if health is the North Star rather than wealth? What is the economy doing? What should it be doing? And that was the journey of prosperity without growth. There was another element to it, which was, can we somehow square the circle? Can we? This is what economists would like us to do, and green economists in particular. They would like us to be able to say, forget that philosophical stuff, Tim. That's not interesting to me. What I want to do is make sure the economy keeps growing. And so, I accept this point that there's too many carbon emissions, there's too many emissions into the water. But surely, if we put new technology in, we can do things more efficiently. We can reduce our carbon emissions, and we can go on reducing our carbon emissions, and we can solve that problem. We don't have to question growth. So there was a lot of that first publication, Prosperity Without Growth, which was sort of saying, is that feasible? Does it work? And the answer that I came up with is that, yes, you can decouple, as the language says, your economic growth from your environmental impact. But actually, you can't do it anything like fast enough if your economy keeps growing to meet your environmental targets. And that ultimately, ultimately, it's a question that we can't really answer because it depends on too many what ifs. But the point is, let's at least have something else on the table other than faster and faster, and hoping to cure the impacts of faster and faster with more and more efficiency or more and more technology. And prosperity without growth articulates that alternative.
And thank you for that. In fact, I wanted to be also a bit provocative in this question because I know some critics and then would say, yes, but what about the ingenuity? What about, for example, now the AI? What about all of that can really create the decoupling? Because maybe your perspective seems based maybe in the 1800s where, there were just production outputs. But now we have decoupled that. So it's more let's say service or intellect economy, how they say, So how would you respond to this critic?
I love critics. I love that they always start with yes, but. I've learned to, I've learned an aversion to yes, but as the respondent, as a response to my ideas. But I've also learned that it has a kind of, it has a mental, what I'm being challenged at my deepest level. Yes, but. So let me kind of answer answer that. The arguments are not arguments against innovation. They're not arguments against ingenuity. They're not arguments from the 18th, 19th century. They are arguments about us in the 21st century. And all of those solutions that those yes but economists are proposing through technology, through efficiency, through AI, through technologization, through the infinite efficiency possibilities of an innovative capitalism, they are aspirational. When you actually look at the data, we have not bent the curve in terms of carbon. We have polluted our soils. We've polluted our oceans. We have rivers which are full of sewage, micropollutants, microplastics, endocrine disruptors. We are living in a world that is undermining our own prosperity. We have not bent that curve. So when you come along and tell me in your yes but question, economics is wonderfully efficient. It's the foundation of technological innovation, and we are very, very creative as species. I accept we are creative as a species. Innovation is possible. You show me the evidence of that decoupling, and not just the evidence of that decoupling, but its ability to continue to decouple as the economy gets bigger and bigger. And I will show you big server farms which are hungry for energy, which is still provided by fossil fuels, which is still increasing carbon in the atmosphere. And all of those technological advances actually are still failing to stabilize our economies and increasingly dividing our populations from each other. If you've got access to AI, and particularly if you're the one that owns the server farms that serve the AI, you are probably doing very well. I'm sure that in wealth terms, you're very prosperous, but that is not a prosperous society when it's impoverishing ordinary people, when it's taking away people's jobs, when it's creating massive demand for energy that cannot possibly be satisfied unless you buy up all the energy resources in the world in your territorial exploitation of the planet. So yeah, that was a little bit of a rant, Sam. I apologize for that, but that's what I feel is being overlooked in the technological optimism of those who respond with that yes but critique.
And thank you for that. I mean, it's grounded in, we have an awful lot, I would say, of evidence that we are destroying our planet, planetary boundaries. We have a lot of limits, and since the 70s, when we had in the previous episode, we discussed about the limits to grow of the Club of Rome with the Secretary General. So I want to discuss this part. We understand that the model is not sustainable. We understand that there are limitations. So which are, in practice, because sometimes we have practitioners, people say, "Oh, Tim, how we can do it?" Which is your, let's say, as if you use a rhetoric, the pars consuela, the argumentation, the practical, how we can do it in a way practical.
In my most recent book, which is called The Care Economy, at the end, one of the authors that I was reading when I was writing The Care Economy was a man called Alan Watts, who was a philosopher actually, and he has this wonderful passage in a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. It's called the book, and he has this wonderful passage in it where he says, "The question, what shall we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. To understand the problem and to know what to do about it are the same thing." And I think, to me, that is the starting point. First of all, you have to understand what the problem is. And there's a sort of rush towards solutions which doesn't understand the problem, which doesn't look at where our North Star has misled us, which doesn't look at the underlying forces, some of those forces that I was talking about, the semi-religious aspects of economic growth, the institutions that locked us into economic growth after the First World War. Understanding where we came from and how we got here really does matter, because if we're just sort of looking at the existing system and saying this system doesn't seem to be one where we could do without growth, because if we didn't have growth everything would collapse, that is not going to tell us what we should do about it, because we have not understood the system. We have not understood what prosperity is. We've not understood where the institutions came from. We've not understood that actually we've been led by a vision that is driving us off a cliff. And so actually, the pragmatic details do matter. And I can definitely come on to some of those with you and talk about some of them specifically. But what matters first and foremost is that understanding, is that idea that this concept of prosperity is driving us in a particular direction. It's not the only possible concept. There is another one. And when we look at that lens, prosperity is health, for example, if prosperity is health, then what should the economy be doing? Maybe it should have as its ethos not growth, but care, because care is the force that brings us back towards health. And as soon as you say that, as soon as you open up that possibility, you end up with a very, very different dynamic. The dynamic of growth is always more, always better, onwards and upwards forever and ever. The dynamic of health is about balance. It's about the ability to restore balance. Sometimes, yeah, you need some growth because you haven't got enough. But sometimes you need to be restoring a system back to have less so that you can reach that point of balance. And it gives you a different lens through which to look at everything. Let me give you just one example. So, a lot of health budgets, particularly even in rich countries, but certainly in poorer countries, are swamped. And they are swamped because of a rising epidemic of chronic disease. Chronic diseases are non-communicable diseases. They result from diet, nutrition, lifestyle, stress, the way that we work, the way that we live. And yet we are creating those conditions ourselves. So the growth-based response to this dynamic is to say, yeah, we need more spending on healthcare. That spending can really only come if it comes from the public sector through more taxes. More taxes can only come through income. Yeah, we're right back to growth. We need more growth to develop this healthcare system to protect us from the chronic diseases that now kill more than 70% of people worldwide. But how do we get that growth? Well, the food industry is a good example. The food industry is going to give us growth. Big food promises growth to politicians. It goes into the lobbies of power and it campaigns for regulations that allow it to grow without limit so that it can contribute to growth. But what it's doing is it's swamping our food systems with cheap engineered calories of very low nutritional quality, which is part of the problem that is making us sick. And then we have a go at that and say, well, we've got this chronic disease. We've got all these people with chronic illnesses. We have to treat them somehow. But that's okay because we have a pharmaceutical industry that can sell lots of drugs for the rest of your life to try to stabilize the symptoms of the fact that you are chronically ill because you ate shit food that wasn't nutritional, because that too was motivated by the pursuit of growth. And you end up with what I would call a totally false economy, because you cannot win that battle. You cannot outrun the bad effects of an unhealthy diet that you have legitimized because it contributes to growth in your economy. And how did I get to that analysis? It's there is the question, what should we do, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. If you don't understand the problem of where that chronic disease is coming from, it's coming from your driving of growth, you will never get to a solution that works because you're continually driving the conditions that led to the problem in the first place. And so this lens that I'm suggesting is exactly that. It's a way of thinking through the problem that allows us to understand it and then allows us to say, actually, maybe we shouldn't be spending all that money trying to treat the after effects of a broken food system. Maybe we should be trying to fix the food system. And actually, we could afford to do it because it would cost less than all the money that's being pumped into trying to save and improve the conditions of people's lives when they've been poisoned by bad food.
I cannot agree more with this. Having had people that they suffer for lymphoma that is linked with glyphosate, and we know in the news now that we need to produce more. Some government in the world, we need to produce more glyphosate for our security. That is insane. But I want to ask you this question. I totally agree with you. The question I would say is this. Tim, you are changing the paradigm. Our politician, our political system, our decision maker, really, they don't like prevention. They like emergency, or they like to give answers. Prevention does not give visibility. And also it creates, how we can also break this cycle, because we have, and this is the first one, no? So we need the emergency of, we need the emergency of OB, we need the emergency of this, just because so we can fix some problem, maybe with some economic, with some help of the big companies. And the second one is this, how we can reframe our way, to look at things. Because I think without a strong governance and policy angle, it will be difficult for business to self-regulate.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I do think regulation matters. I think there's a really interesting physiological analogy here, an analogy that comes from biology, from our own biology, the biology of our bodies, which is based, our own health, looking at our own health, how our own health is regulated. Our own health is regulated day by day, minute by minute, second by second, by the autonomic nervous system, which is constantly regulating balance of our heart rate, our body temperature, our blood pressure, our glucose level, our dopamine level, you name it. These regulatory processes go on and on and on. They are regulatory processes. They are trying to keep things in balance by ensuring that certain parameters remain within certain limits. That is the function of governance. What that does is it allows us as organisms to be healthy. And to be healthy means to be able to go out into the world to do the things we want to do, not just to survive, but to thrive. In other words, this role of regulation, the role of governance, which has had such a bad rap in society, is actually the foundation of prosperity. It's the foundation of health. And so that kind of is an argument to me that comes directly from our own biology that suggests that we've got the wrong philosophical concept driving us. And growth, although it appears in biology, is not the regulator. Growth is not the most important consideration. It's a part of a consideration. But the most important consideration is that this restorative power of care. And that's what the economy should be doing. That's how it should be organized. Those stabilizing mechanisms have to be present, and they do need a regulating force to do that in society, which we call government. If it's not doing that, it's not doing the right thing. It's not even a government. It's actually a non-government, because it's in bed with powerful financial interests and laying ground conditions which destabilize us, which take us away from health purely so that we can pursue profit for a few. And that's a travesty. That's the opposite of what government should be.
And I agree with that. It's a very powerful analogy. And I want to do again a bit provocative. I'm sitting here and in the Rift Valley. We know Africa, it's an emerging continent, and Kenya is one of the booming economies. We have a youth population. We are still have huge inequalities and things. So when the discussion is about prosperity, growth, some people may interpret it, oh, is how so how you can have prosperity without growth. So how can we do, how we can, my question is how we can develop differently. So the debate is not you need to stay poor, but how you can avoid the mistakes that other country has done, and which model we can foster here.
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm always a bit nervous about it because it's sounds like me. I'm a white male economist coming from a northern country, telling Kenya how it should develop. That's absolutely not what I like to do at all. And I think one of the reasons not to do it, apart from the obvious, slightly dubious history of colonialism and doing exactly that, is that quite often what we've done is we've trod roughshod over indigenous wisdom that already knows what it should be doing. In Post Growth, which is the book between Prosperity Without Growth and the Care Economy, there's one chapter there. Each chapter is dedicated to one individual, I suppose, or a couple of individuals sometimes. And it was, for me, it was a way of paying homage to that idea that wisdom exists in all sorts of places. And one of the chapters, which I call A Canopy of Hope, is dedicated to Wangari Maathai, who, as you know, was born and lived in Kenya, and put together. She was the leader in a movement, particularly for poor Kenyan women, to create the conditions for their own prosperity. And this was indigenous wisdom. This was the wisdom of women, of ordinary women, to just plant trees, to create this, to regenerate the soils, to reverse the damage of colonialism. And she says, and it's the quote that I use at the beginning of the chapter: the roots of our future will bury themselves in the ground, and a canopy of hope will reach into the sky. Now, this is not just wisdom, it's poetry. And it's poetry that belongs outside of the white Western economic model altogether, but does exist in Kenya, does exist in indigenous communities, is still there in some forms. And one of the things that really inspired me, I think, after Prosperity Without Grace was written and it achieved this, I'm not saying worldwide, but it was definitely international acclaim at the time, was that I had not written it for the people who came back to me and said, "Thank you for writing that. I think you'll find this interesting." And they'll point me towards Ubuntu, or they'll point me towards Wangari Maathai. They'll point me towards indigenous knowledge. And they say, "I think some of what you're looking for is here, Tim." And it was very humbling in a way, but it was also inspirational that that wisdom exists. It exists in different ways in different places. And it is at the mercy, though, of a system for which I, my my demographic, my, not necessarily my age group, but my fathers and my forefathers were responsible for trying to destroy. And so, what I see, when people say to me, "Well, Kenya is not the UK. Poor countries are not rich countries. They don't have the possibilities that rich countries have." I see that. I see it differently. It's not about the power of rich countries to help poor countries. It's not even about the powers that poor countries don't have as opposed to rich countries. It is about the responsibility of rich countries actually to take their foot off the accelerator that has driven the global economy into a crisis that is destroying the indigenous wisdom of ordinary people in those poorer countries. And that, to me, is, that too is a sort of is an act of care. It's an act of bringing us back into balance, paying unpaid debts, investing in real prosperity, and allowing that indigenous wisdom actually to express itself in the places where it's needed.
And thank you for that, Tim. It's exactly, I mean, I would say that as a grassroots practitioner, in here, they're trying to put reforestation, clean cooking, trying to regenerative agriculture, getting away from the model pumping, maybe sometimes even companies pumping chemicals and stuff. And and this is something that it's important, is often overlooked, but it's a drop on the ocean, to create this sustainable prosperity for all. And I want to ask you a question about, before maybe going into the last one, just to ask you a question about your other life. You are a dramatist, you have award winning, you have done, I mean, wonderful work. So I want to ask you the question about storytelling, because it's very important. The power of storytelling can change mentalities. It's going back a bit to the question about how we change this. So how we can reframe, also, and use storytelling to tell people, you know, we need to let go this growth obsession and, change our beliefs for a better planet.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think when I wrote Prosperity Without Grief, without Prosperity Without Grief, Prosperity Without Growth, I think I don't know. I mean, I was already a playwright at that point. I came into playwriting before I became accidentally an economist, and I always believed in the power of story, and I always believed that that's how you move people, is by their allowing them to relate to each other, people to relate to each other as human beings. And those kind of social relations is what the artist knows how to do. The scientist doesn't always, and the economist very rarely does. And so, in a way, my early life was a kind of a conflict, because I was working as a playwright, but I was also working as an academic economist. And when I was on the Sustainable Development Commission, I was almost a quasi-governmental economist trying to advise governments. And when I wrote Prosperity Without Growth, I wrote it with a very particular logic that if I could get the argument right, if I could get the logic perfect, nobody could possibly disagree with it, and they would have to change the way government works. That, as it turned out, I mean, I'm not sure that I totally believed it at the time, but I definitely worked under that assumption. If I could write the book as well as I possibly could, then it would have the biggest impact it could by changing things in government on Monday morning. And that, of course, was totally naive. And it was naive because people are not primarily logical. They are primarily, or at least equally, they are emotional. And the visceral response of that official that I mentioned earlier when we were speaking to the proposal, even to think about this issue, that visceral response was not a logical one. It wasn't a rational one. It was something coming from, a deeply embedded belief in the sanctity of the discipline of economics and the pursuit of economic growth. It was irrational. And I mentioned that, that sort of semi-religious aspect to it, as though that's a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing because we need irrational stuff as well as rational stuff. So the academic economist in me was trying to be as rational, as logical as possible. And the playwright in me already knew that you need story to connect people. And actually, I mentioned post-growth is mostly story. It's mostly the story of individuals who've tried to do something slightly differently so that we could see the world differently. And I think that's the power of story. And we have to, I'm not saying we throw rationality away. I'm not saying we throw analytic reasoning away. I'm not saying we throw economics away, but we have to frame our economics through story as much as we do through numerical analysis.
And that is very important. It is actually sometimes also a very powerful lesson for activists, for people. Sometimes the bare number, the science, does not take you to decision making or to change of behavior. So it's we need also to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that.
Mhm.
Totally agree.
We push a
Yeah.
lot of data and then people never change. And I mean a last question, for you, because it's a very powerful work. I mean, the perspective, but looking at, what we can realistically do. So, for example, a business that is listening to us, a person, what we can do really to foster these, apart reading maybe the books.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that is a very interesting question. It's one that after Prosperity Without Growth was published, I thought about a lot. I did quite a lot of research around it. There was a vision, in a sense. I make this point again and again, but it starts with vision. And there's one particular visionary shift that I think is very important for enterprise. So what is an enterprise? What is an enterprise doing? And the conventional view of what an enterprise is doing, and it's more or less the one that's embedded when you do an MBA in business, is that the business of business is business. It's Milton Friedman's wonderful line. It's about profit. It's about the bottom line. That's what you're doing. That's what your structure is. If you're not making that profit, if that profit is not growing, you're not doing your job as a business. It's a very thin version of what enterprise is. And actually, it doesn't even accord with the evidence that we have for people who are working as entrepreneurs. I had a student who did a wonderful study, actually, of small and medium-sized enterprises, looking at what motivated the people who were working in those enterprises, who were the entrepreneurs. And what she found was that actually, primarily, it's the idea of being a good guy, having a good place in society to provide some service to society that is valuable. Now, that's a very different thing to just pursuing profit for the sake of it. And where it takes you is that your model of enterprise is not, I'm going to dig stuff up out of the ground. I'm going to process as efficiently as possible in a factory. I'm not going to worry about the impacts of that on the environment. I'm going to sell my products as fast as possible in the biggest market so that I can have the biggest profit. Business of business is business. I am now an entrepreneur. That's one vision. The other vision is of service, takes you to a totally different place. What is my enterprise? What am I doing in society? What is the service that I provide in society? And I did this with my students for a couple of decades, get them to ask that question. And it's what's powerful about that exercise is how easily they get to the idea of enterprise as a different thing, something that is providing service to society. And the fact that actually that is the core motivation of entrepreneurs, to be good in society, to produce good for society, that is a bonus. It's because you have a vision of enterprise that is totally different from this business of business is business, and it's supported by the motivations of the people who become the entrepreneurs. So now what do you need to do? You need to create the conditions that those entrepreneurs can be the people that they want to be in society. And where service is rewarded, where quality is rewarded, where your ability to protect the environment is rewarded, where your ability to care is reinforced by the structures of society. And that's, I'm not saying that every business, every enterprise can do that for itself. It can't in a society which penalizes it for doing the right thing, but it gives you the direction of travel.
And this resonates a lot with many episodes and also my daily experience talking with startups, talking with enterprise here, in the emerging markets, because everybody starts with a social problem. We want to solve a problem in our community. We want to empower. We want to support them. So it's not about just profit, but it's more holistic. Although I mean, from my MBA, it's just the bottom line, or you're out. So, Tim, thank you so much for this wonderful episode. Has been really a pleasure and honor having you to the podcast.
Thank you, Samuel. It's been a great discussion, and I hope that that it reaches your listeners in a way that doesn't appear like another colonial economist trying to impose a broken vision on an unfortunate world. I think it is, to go back to that quote about understanding the problem as being the way towards the solution. It, to me, is a conversation. It's a conversation that needs to be opened up, that needs to have different voices in it, and that ultimately is itself an act of care towards a better economy, a better society, a way to prosper in the sense of our collective health.
And thank you so much, Tim. I mean, a wonderful closure, and I really appreciate your insights. And then we will put all the links in the episode so people can go and read and really continue the conversation. Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Tim.
Thanks, Samuel.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.